Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this roundtable on queer Jews and Muslims. I'm very happy to see so many of you turn up and very pleased to be in conversation with four excellent scholars representing a variety of fields. So I'm just going to introduce the context here a little bit of this roundtable and the project of which this roundtable has emerged, as well as our contributors, and then I will tell you a little bit about how the rest of this event is going to go. So the four contributors that we have here today, Professor Robert Phillips, Dr. Shanon Shah, Professor Edwige Crucifix, and Professor Katrina Thompson, are part of a edited volume that we've been preparing that's titled Queer Jews, Race, Religion, and Representation. So this is a collection of essays that departs from a variety of disciplinary and interdisciplinary perspectives in order to examine the interrelated experiences and representations of Jewish and Muslim minorities, particularly in Europe and North America, while triangulating the Jewish-Muslim dyad with a third variable, queerness. So the book brings together several leading scholars, including the four that are here now, in order to reflect on the intersection between gender, sexuality, race, religion, and identity in relation to Jewish and Muslim populations, particularly in North America and Europe. And this focus on, this comparative focus, we found is important for several reasons, including the similarly racialized and gendered and sexualized positions of Jews and Muslims in European pasts and presents, the cultural and theological similarities, but also the often polarized and oppositional representations of Jewishness and Muslimness in North America and Europe. In addition, how contemporary Islamophobia increasingly functions by constructing Jews and Muslims as inherently hostile to LGBT plus people, women, Jews, and liberalism, secularism, and democracy more generally. So by bringing together these different voices in this collection, we are trying to take a comparative approach to study the convergences and divergences in representations and lived experiences of Jewish and Muslim gender and sexual minorities in Europe and North America, in order to critically examine and challenge the construction of LGBT plus people, Jews and Muslims, as separable, as separate. So so just a final word on the book. I think that what is unique about this endeavor that we're all engaged in is that we are all trying to place the question of gender and sexuality at the heart of, and not merely at the subsection of, ethno-religious identity and spiritualities, in such a way that that not only queers Jewish and Muslim studies, but also queers queer studies, and hopefully help broaden the horizon of Jewish and Muslim coexistence, and more importantly, co-resistance. Because after all, the colonialism, racism, sexism, queerphobia, and transphobia that are all part and parcel of our power structures are killing all of us, some more quickly than others, whether we're Jewish or Muslim or any other spiritual or ethnic identity. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. So Professor Thompson works at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, where they are a professor of African cultural studies and also the director of the program in African languages and a core faculty member in second language acquisition. Their research uses critical ethnography and critical discourse analysis to examine African and Muslim discourse with projects in Zimbabwe, Tanzania, North America, and online. Their third monograph, titled Misfits, Rebels, and Queers, an ethnography of Muslims on the margin, is under contract with NYU Press. Next, we have Robert Phillips, who is an associate professor of anthropology and the associate director of the Jewish Studies program at Ball State University. Professor Phillips has published recently a book titled Virtual Activism, Sexuality, the Internet, and a Social Movement in Singapore. And currently, he is looking at how queer and Jewish individuals are embracing alternative models in the healing of individual and collective trauma. Next, we have Edwige Crucifix, who is an assistant professor at I'm sorry, I'm forgetting right now which university. Could you jump in and just remind me?
It's Bryn College.
That's it. Yep. Sorry about that. She's a specialist in gender studies and post-colonial theory. Her current book project explores mechanisms of identity construction in colonial society in the works of French and North African women. And her research and teaching stems from an interdisciplinary interest in modes of cultural resistance, explored in previous publications dedicated to modernist aesthetics, 19th century bourgeois taste, and interwar Jewish identity. And last but not least, Shanon Shah, Dr. Shanon Shah, who I'm very happy to introduce, not least because he is originally from across the border from where I was born in Singapore. Dr. Shah is, he conducts research on minority religions, alternative spiritualities at the Information Network focus on religious movements, Inform, based at King's College London. And he is also a tutor in interfaith relations at the University of London's Divinity Program. He is also the director of Faith for the Climate, a faith-inspired network of climate justice activists, and an editor at Critical Muslim, the flagship quarterly publication of the Muslim Institute, a London-based educational fellowship. And finally, I'm Adi Saleem Bharat. I'm currently an LSA Collegiate Fellow and an incoming assistant professor in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures. I'd like to thank the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies for making this happen, as well as the Jewish Muslim Research Network. And of course, to Jillian, whose hard work makes all of this possible. Perhaps we could, before that, so what's going to happen now is each of the contributors are going to spend about 5 to 10 minutes to tell us a little bit about their chapters, how they came to work on the topic at hand, after which we will proceed to have a short conversation amongst ourselves before taking questions and points from the audience. So you'll see on the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. You can click on that and post your questions as they occur to you while the speakers are speaking, and we'll get to them later on. It would be best not to use the chat function and to keep questions to the Q&A box on your screen. All right, Professor Thompson, would you like to begin?
Sure, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me and all of us to participate today. I'm excited to be part of this volume and part of this conversation today. Broadly speaking, my work engages with language, gender, and sexuality in Muslim communities. I've done extensive work among Swahili-speaking Muslims in Tanzania. And as Adi mentioned, more recently, I've been doing ethnographic work with non-conformist, in other words, feminist and queer inclusive Muslim communities in North America and online. My chapter in the edited volume is titled Queer Jewish-Muslim, constructing hyphenated religious identities through tactics of intersubjectivity. In the chapter, I take a queer anthropological approach to entangled queer Jewish-Muslim identities and relationships, first in the existing literature, and then by examining how two contemporary individuals involved in queer inclusive Muslim groups navigate their hyphenated religious identities, practices, and heritages. Reviewing past studies of early Jewish conversion to Islam and Muslim-Jewish interaction, I demonstrate that Jewish and Muslim cultural syncretism has been well documented, but usually treated as distinct from religion. That is, while scholars often depict cultural boundaries between Muslims and Jews as non-existent, they nevertheless tend to treat religious borders as clear-cut. And the assumption of clear-cut boundaries is so taken for granted that even in the face of contradictory evidence, scholars continue to depict Muslims and Jews as binary opposites. But I show the presence of queer Muslim Jews in the archive reveals that the line between Judaism and Islam is more like a hyphen, more permeable than it may seem. Some individuals refused to be contained by orthodox binaries, and this refusal allowed them to queer their religious beliefs, practices, and identities. Finally, I turn to two contemporary queer individuals to show how they frame their queer Jewish Muslim experiences, continuing this queer hyphenation in the present. I argue that queer boundary disruption is useful as a framework because it helps us pay attention to gender, sexuality, race, religion intersections, sites where boundaries can still be made porous. So let me say a little bit about these two individuals that I focus on in the chapter and how I came to know them. David, a gay intersex male presenting person in Toronto, is Jewish, but attends a queer inclusive Muslim mosque nearly every Friday, sometimes even giving this sermon. Keegan, a gay Arab non-binary person who grew up in Iraq and Syria and now lives in Southern California, identifies as both Jewish and Muslim and is an active participant in a queer inclusive Muslim online group. I met them both while conducting multi-sited ethnographic research in several interconnected Muslim groups and mosques, loosely affiliated with what others have called the progressive Muslim movement, the subject of my forthcoming book out next year from NYU. When I began the project in January 2016, I conceived of it as a study of progressive Muslims, but I have since come to consider them nonconformist Muslims. I use this label to reflect these communities' radical inclusion of anyone who considers themselves a Muslim, even those who transgress some or many normative Islamic interpretations. Although not everyone involved in these groups is queer in terms of sexuality or gender, queer is central to their practices and discourse because of participants' nonconformity with dominant Muslim norms, including their religious pluralism. Across all the groups where I conducted participant observation, members are predominantly Muslim, but welcome non-Muslims like David. Many identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, non-binary, queer, or some combination of those categories. In my chapter, I examine David and Keegan's talk and texts using a sociolinguistic tactics of intersubjectivity framework to understand how they position themselves in relation to Islam, Judaism, and queerness, or as I put it, queer-Jewish-Muslimness. David's and Keegan's use of such tactics, I argue, enable them to articulate understandings of Islam and Judaism that do not depend on abstract orthodox interpretations of either religion, but rather on their own local, contingent, and contextually specific acts, which are crucially linked to their queerness. In particular, I show that they use adequation to underscore similarities between Judaism and Islam, Jews and Muslims. They use authentication to demonstrate the ties between the past and their present-day identities. Keegan as a Muslim Jew with dual ancestries, and David as a North African Jew whose ancestors had close relationships and shared traditions with Muslims. David also uses authorization to represent participation in a Muslim community as part of an authentic tradition of Jewish Sufism. Finally, both of them use distinction to differentiate themselves from those who would use their religions to oppress queers. I conclude that constructing hyphenated queer Muslim Jewish identities both links these categories and plays on the spaces between them. In the space of the hyphen, we can tactically and intersubjectively create similarities across and within difference, as David told me, existing in relationship to each other without losing the self. I'll stop there, and when it's time for the Q&A, I'd be happy to answer questions either or both about the chapter and about the larger project in my forthcoming book. Thank you.
I think we have Rob next up, right? You're still muted, Rob, sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Adi, and thank you for arranging this event, and thank you for inviting me to participate. Yeah, my chapter in this volume is called A Corpus Assisted Analysis of the Discursive Construction of LGBTQ Muslims and Jews in the UK media. So it's quite a mouthful. My work on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia really comes from a few different places. You know, as Adi mentioned, I'm the associate director of our Jewish Studies program, and I supervise a number of undergraduate students who do research on anti-Semitism in East Central Indiana. I'm currently, you know, a lot of my work besides that looks at queer Jewish men who are returning to observance. And I've written quite a bit about that. And I'm currently working on a project looking at queer Jews and the uses of psychedelics to heal communal trauma. And so I've done, you know, I have a lot of experience with working with queer Jews. And I'm including my biology. I have a biology background as well, so I'm including that in this sort of pharmacological project. And this project actually comes out of a recent project that I worked on with Adi, it was looking at LGBT Jews in Singapore. And the project I was doing then was looking at portrayals of LGBTQ Singaporeans in the press and trying to get an idea of, you know, the differences between the portrayals in the state-run media versus citizen-run media. And so I begin this project, you know, sort of leapfrogging on that one and thinking, okay, so how can this be applied to groups outside of Singapore, the same type of analysis? And so I began the project because I began to notice a lot of newspaper articles. I've always followed the British press, and I noticed in 2018, 2019, a large number of articles about Islamophobic attacks, Islamophobic or anti-Semitic attacks, you know, even things coming from the Prime Minister aimed at Muslims. And I began to sort of think, okay, let's try this and see what happens, trying to sort of repeat this experiment. The most recent event, of course, was just last week, I believe, in London, when a group of Jewish students were heading to a Hanukkah celebration, and they were accosted by a group of other youth who were, you know, spitting at them and doing Hitler signs, that type of thing. So this kind of thing, I mean, it's still prevalent. So the method I was using, as I said before, is corpus linguistics, and that really involves just compiling texts from a variety of sources and then analyzing those texts in order to expose patterns related to grammatical or lexical features of the texts. And so, and again, the idea here is that individual words themselves in texts don't have as much meaning as those words do when they're analyzed as part of a larger sequence of text, right? So it's about context. And so I created 3 different bodies of literature, or bodies of text, following along some recent work by Jones and Collins from 2020, looking at how the British press portrayed the use of PrEP by gay and bisexual men. And so I created three bodies of text, one from a liberal or left-leaning source, The Guardian, one from what I consider a centrist newspaper, The Independent, and then a third corpus from a right-leaning newspaper, The Telegraph. Unfortunately, The Telegraph didn't have very many references to LGBT Muslims or Jews, and so I had to combine that with the Daily Mail to get somewhat of a substantial corpus to work with. And so again, yeah, I use software, I analyze the text, and the text reveals patterns. And so in this work, several patterns were revealed. And I think some of them, at least for me, were fairly obvious. There was what I would call sort of a status hierarchy in place, where Catholic/Christian text or discourse was very favorable across the line, across all the media outlets. And Islam and Judaism were often treated very differently, right? With Islam being demonized, basically, which again is not unexpected. I think and again, I'm still analyzing the data, but I think just for instance, the body of text from the Guardian newspaper, right? And again, I should have said this earlier, but I collected newspaper articles from 2016 to 2020, right? So just a 5-year period. And I was hoping in a way that it would line up with Trump's time in office, because I wanted to see sort of what happened, right, during that period as well. For instance, I think a lot of just for instance, from the Guardian newspaper, a lot of the discourse around LGBTQ Muslims and Jews dealt with ideas of community, right? Focusing on how people interact with each other. It also critiqued in a large way American politics, right? So as I mentioned earlier, President Trump, but also lots of references to white supremacy in the US, lots of references to Steve Bannon, other people like that. And again, similarly, I analyzed the text from The Independent and then the right-leaning newspapers. Not surprisingly, I mean, again, I think just as an example, the noun Muslim appeared in the top 10 of all terms for the Guardian and the Independent, but in the Daily Telegraph, it did not. Islam was, I think, 77th in the Guardian, or I'm sorry, in the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail. But what I thought was interesting there is that ISIL or ISIS does appear in the top 10, and the ISIL/ISIS is, I believe, a placeholder for Islam in the right-leaning media. Lots of sort of references like that. And I think I want to stop there. I don't want to sort of speak too much. I think the one thing I will say, though, is the thing that I was surprised at the most was what I would call the erasure of LGBTQ Jews from the media, because there is very little. I was sort of shocked that so much of the text dealt with Islam and very little with Judaism. So that's all. That's all for now, and I'll appreciate any comments and questions when we get there. So thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Addie and Jillian, for organizing this and for all your hard work. So My talk is entitled Queer Disguises, Jewish Women's Performance of Race and Gender in the Colonial Maghreb. And as it suggests, I am a scholar of the Francophone Maghreb, which is to say North Africa, in this case specifically Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. And generally speaking, I'm interested in ways of negotiating identity in the face of empire. So I work mostly on the imperial period, the period of French occupation of the Maghreb, which is in my case, the 19th century and the early 20th century. But one of the motivations I think for my work is all of the echoes that I see between that period and what is happening now in what I could maybe call France's resistance to be polite to difference today, and especially to visible difference. You might perhaps be familiar with the cases, the many discussions that are taking place in the country now, that have been taking place in the country for a long time, in public discourse surrounding the wearing of the hijab, or what the French call the veil, which is one of the obsessions that that France comes back to all the time. And in my research, I'm interested in unreadability in particular as a technique that is being used by women or by minority groups to resist the imposition of categories, to resist labeling, and to resist ostracization. So, you know, how can you make yourself be unreadable? What do you lose when you make yourself unreadable? What can you gain? And in this chapter, this, you know, comes to play in a specific way as I study the overlap between race, gender, and sexuality, specifically in the work of Jewish women. And in particular here, I focus on two novels where I analyze the presentation and the performance of identity as a disguise. And I mean here disguise in the most literal way possible, since characters in both novels engage in drag, cross-dressing, and other masquerading practices, so to speak. And the two novels I study are Elisa Raïs's Le Mariage de Hanifa, Hanifa's Wedding from 1926, where two women's desire for the same man morphs into a reciprocal attraction and ultimately serves to question racial delineations and hierarchies. And Blanche Bendaon's very radical Messieurs, vous êtes impuissants, Sir, you are impotent, very telling title from 1961, which is a dystopian novel where justice will be brought through sexual reassignment and miscegenation. And the latter novel is absolutely crazy. It has extraterrestrials, many weird things happening. I won't get to describe the novels too much because this presentation is very short, but they're certainly an interesting read if anyone is interested or reads French. And so when reading them, I argue that contrary to what has been assumed by some scholars, Maghrebi female writers in the colonies did not only depict sexual desire and Oriental femininity to appeal to a metropolitan audience, though it was certainly part of the marketing strategy, but rather that their work treats gender and sexuality as thoroughly unstable categories, whose very often improper performance becomes the ground for self-determination and even, I argue, for the articulation of anti-patriarchal and anti-imperial sentiment. And in this sense, presenting gender and sexuality as disguises reveals the instability and even the absurdity, I think, of other identity categories, most specifically racial categories, and can be therefore read as a symptom and a critique of what Albert Memmi has called the pénible et constante ambiguïté, the painful and constant ambiguity of North African Jewish identity, and most specifically of North African Jewish female identity. So I will not really get into the novels, but in the chapter I proceed to kind of close reading of the text, which is really anchored in a very specific historical context. And since not everyone is familiar with the context, that's what I will give you in this presentation. So there are three main contextual points that I would like to mention that inform what is happening in the texts. The first one is the creation of the Maghreb as a queer space during the colonial period. And here it's important to understand that the Maghreb, which was presented simultaneously as the epitome of patriarchal oppression and as a territory for sexual experimentation and conquest, really becomes a kind of sexual utopia in the colonial period, especially during the 19th century, whereupon the French project and can maybe act out their wildest fantasies. And this is very evident, of course, in Orientalist art and literature, but it was also relayed in scientific discourse, such as medical and legal treatises, for instance. And even though most authors really focused on same-sex relationships between men, because they didn't really think that same-sex relationship between women could be considered as being sexual, they treat them in kind of the same vein. And here you can think, for instance, of the sapphic undertones in Orientalist paintings from the period. The second point I want to mention is the adoption of cross-dressing practices by European women in the colonial Maghreb, for whom the queerness of the region was not only attractive for its homoeroticism, but also because it afforded them new possibilities in the performance of gender, but also in the performance of everyday activity. And so in the Orient, it oftentimes happened that European women partook in an act of double drag in a way, which was kind of socially accepted, by cross-dressing as Arab men in order to gain greater mobility. And here, the best example of this that you can think of is Isabelle Bharat, who adopted a whole other Muslim male persona when traveling in North Africa. And finally, the third contextual element is the deculturation of Maghrebi Jews due to French colonialism, what Benjamin Stora has called an exile from their own identity, which goes along with the access of Jewish women to authorship and publication through French, which happens, I'd say on average in the countries I study, about 1 or 2 generations earlier than for other indigenous groups in the Maghreb. And that really marks a radical shift in their condition by crystallizing both a moment of unprecedented alienation and of unprecedented agency. So the dynamics that I highlight in the novels are at the same time facilitated, caused, and at times paradoxically impeded by this context, and offer a kind of Saidian counterpoint to the way that it unfolds. And a lot of that has to do with who these authors were, which is to say Algerian Jewish women writing in French, educated in French, we might even say decultured in French, and both struggled with their own disguises. Bendaon confesses her temptation to hide behind a Christian name when she's publishing this novel. And it's even more striking in Rais's case because her French publisher, Plon, felt actually the need to have her pass, she was a Jewish Algerian woman, I repeat, as a Muslim woman who had escaped from a harem, both to make her seem a more enticing figure, but also to fend off anti-Semitic feelings. So I won't get into the details of the novel. I'll stop about there. But my conclusion, in a way, when I look at the way that all of this is taking shape in the text, is to suggest, first of all, that one disguise hides another, but also that the act of disguising is done as a performance to show something, to show a zone where there is an issue, and ultimately to undo the status quo.
Yes, and I guess I'm up next. So hi, everyone. And just to echo what everyone else has said, thanks so much, Adi and Gillian, for putting this together. And it's a real pleasure to be on this really fantastic panel. My chapter, I guess, has lots of resonances with what's been presented already, which is a good thing, because I think this means it's a really cohesive and exciting volume that we're all part of. But there are also some points at which I depart. So I'll just give some context first before I talk about my chapter, like what I was thinking before I sort of wrote it and thought about writing it. So my chapter is called Queering the Abrahamic Scriptures. And I was reflecting, because I did my ethnographic research for my PhD around 2012 and 2013, and I finished my PhD in 2015. And I published my monograph that came out of my PhD in 2018. So my monograph is called The Making of a Gay Muslim, Religion, Sexuality, and Identity in Malaysia and Britain. But even since then, and I was coming across a lot of this while I was doing my research, but since I finished, I still notice a growing visibility and representation of queer Muslim experiences by queer Muslims within Muslim spaces and also in mainstream spaces, especially in the West. So I've already talked about my own work, but it's also worth mentioning lots of other pioneering scholarly works on queer Muslims, including by the American scholar Scott Siraj al-Haq Google, the French scholar Ludovic Mohamed Zahid, who is also an openly gay imam, Samar Habib. And I have to say here that scholars like me probably owe a debt to scholars like Scott Kugel for, showing us that this is possible. It's possible to take this as an area of research, and also an avenue of personal inquiring into your own journey as a queer Muslim. And this is not just in the scholarly space, there's increasing visibility in popular culture. I remember around the time that I was finishing my PhD, there was a show called Muslim Drag Queens that was aired on Channel 4. A couple of comedies this year, We Are Lady Parts, the British comedy aired on Channel 4, has a queer Muslim theme. The Canadian series Sort Of. There are books, memoirs by people like Amru Al-Qadi called Unicorn about their experiences as a Muslim drag queen and so on. And before I came into academia, I also was involved in this kind of cultural production. I wrote a play about homophobic and transphobic bullying in a boys' school back in Malaysia. My place in the Malay language is called Aircon, and recently it had an online revival during the COVID lockdown in Malaysia as well. And then I think, as Katrina has mentioned as well, there's a growth of queer-friendly spiritual Muslim spaces, such as the Inclusive Mosque Initiative in the UK and a few others that Katrina has already mentioned. And this is an addition to specifically LGBTQ+ Muslim organizations that had already existed by the time I was doing my research. So organizations such as Iman in the UK, Al-Fatiha in the US, and Salam Canada, and so on. So there's this growing space, which for me personally was exciting to watch, to see, but they were all emerging against an idea that was still very, very dominant, and that is still very dominant, which is that Islam is inherently hostile towards sexual diversity and queer sexuality. And there's a backlash against this queer Muslim visibility as well. So I'll just outline the backlash here. There's a variant of the backlash that I just don't mention in the chapter, because that's just not what I'm addressing, but it's basically from the Islamophobic far right. It's like, stop talking about how, these queer Muslims are happy being queer and Muslim because you're just whitewashing Islam, right? It's still a barbaric religion, so don't do this, you're lying. But like I said, I'm not spending any time talking about that today. I'm more interested in the other variants of the backlash. So from scholars such as Joseph Massad, which I think, they are valid to a large extent, where they feel that sexuality is an instrument of neocolonialism, and the obsession with LGBTQ+ Muslims actually feeds a white savior narrative, which is very similar to the colonial feminist narrative, such as when President George W. Bush invaded Afghanistan supposedly to save Afghan women from the burqa. But, was he a fan of abortion or women's rights or LGBT rights in the US? No, he wasn't. So there's that kind of backlash happening as well. So there's a worry that there's a manipulation of progressive or liberal interpretations of Islam to prop up the global status quo. And I get that. And the third variant of the backlash, I think, comes from more traditionalist defenders of Islamic studies who feel that queer-sensitive interpretations of Islam are just wrong or misguided or ignorant or ill-informed. So there's a new binary that gets created, which is the real traditional Muslims versus the Muslim sellouts who try and make Islam queer-sensitive and progressive, right? And somewhere in there, I think, is another binary between authoritative Islam and lived experiences, right? So where do we derive authority in Islam from? Is it from the text? Is it from the tradition? Or is it from lived experiences of Muslims? Now, there are many different ways to challenge these binaries. And now I get to my chapter. My chapter is just one way that I'm thinking of how to challenge these binaries. And the way I'm doing it in this chapter is by thinking about engagement with sacred text as a lived experience. Now, why am I taking this perspective? Because I'm a social scientist, I'm a sociologist of religion, and there's been the lived religion or everyday religion turn in the sociology of religion, where the idea is that if you want to understand religion in the modern world, you also have to look at how people live it every day, not just what the institutions say and not just what the text says, right? But in here, I think there are questions about, well, then how do you treat the text? What is the text? You just disregard the text and look at what people do and say and behave. And also for me, it's personal because I'm a queer Muslim and Islam carries a deep spiritual meaning and significance for me in my own way. So I've already mentioned one of the theoretical and methodological reasons for doing this. And somewhere in there is also a question about epistemological authority in religious interpretation. So what counts as proper knowledge in Islam? So I engage a little bit with critical pedagogy, with Black feminist literature. I cite Patricia Hill Collins a little bit and see how that can be applied to the case of queer Muslims. So how is this relevant to this volume? So this is about, a lot of it goes into my own journey, into my own way of approaching the Quran. And I found that I was probably doing something different in my personal life compared to the scholars I was responding to or engaging with, whether it was in the realm of queer Muslim scholarship or traditionalist Muslim rebuttals of queer Muslim scholarship, where a lot of the discussion was, well, what does Islam say? What do we find in the Muslim tradition? What does the Quran say? And these were all really sophisticated discussions, but they were still focusing on Islamic scriptures as a taken for granted, self-evident representation of Islam as a neatly bounded religion. Whereas my approach was much more pluralistic, intertextual. I was reading the Quran alongside the Hebrew scriptures. Partly this is because of my Malaysian background as well, as Adi points out. I grew up in a mixed race, mixed religious family. I'm very comfortable with religious plurality and hybridity. And even now I am in a civil partnership with an openly gay Anglican priest. So I probably go to church more than I go to the mosque now, so I'm a religious hybrid. But also partly because that's where the research is as well with the Quran. So the hybridity that is in the text, the intertextuality within the Quran, how it is in dialogue with Jewish and Christian scriptures, whether they are canonical now or apocryphal, that active dialogue that can be found within the Quran. So I highlight some of the examples of this, such as the commentaries on the stories of the Prophet Lut in traditional Islamic Quranic scholarship, compared to some of the rabbinical stories, commentaries, I should say, about Sodom and Gomorrah. So I have a few questions then, because I've laid out the scholarship on it, but I've also talked about myself to investigate the reception, both of scholarship on queerness and Islam and religion, but also on the text themselves, the engagement of the text. And again, as a sociologist, this is like, how do we present ourselves as scholars of lived experiences of religion when we are also doing work with the text, right? So it's a bit of a reflection on that. And my question is, what do we do with questions of hybridity or bricolage when people seem to just pull together different elements that don't seem to make sense, but it does make sense to them and they're doing it for a purpose? And I think lots of queer Muslims do that. And I think that the other presenters who have spoken today have given these as examples as well. There's lots more that I could say, but I will wait for the question and answer because I think I've run out of time. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And like Shanon was just saying, you can already see there's plenty of resonances between each chapter, and plenty that makes each contribution quite unique as well. So just a reminder that you can begin typing in your questions in the Q&A box, and then we will answer them. We'll get to them together as and when they appear. To begin with, I have a few. I have on the one hand some general questions for everyone, and I also have some specific questions. And I think I'd like to start with the specific questions. Katrina, I have a question for you in particular. So in your chapter, so I've got two questions actually. So you write about tactics of intersubjectivity that your participants use. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more, especially those of us who who might not be very familiar with what this term is and in what disciplinary context it's used. So just kind of explain tactics of intersubjectivity and how your participants make sense of their intersectional identities and make claims about their belonging and their belonging in certain spaces using these tactics. And the other question was, I was very interested in your chapter. You make a comparison between Shabbatay Zevi and your two participants, and you write, you're quoting in part from Alpert, seen on occasion studying the Quran while wearing the tefillin of the pious Jew, Zevi was not unlike the two contemporary queer Muslim Jewish individuals I introduced below. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us more about this comparison and how you read your two the two individuals that you discuss throughout your chapter in light of of maybe a kind of historical antecedent, and whether maybe your participants also feel a kind of identification with historical figures that, as a way to kind of tie their beliefs and the way that they're formulating their lives to something that has a history, whether that at all takes place.
Do you want me to go ahead now, or do you want to ask everyone questions first? Okay. So the tactics of intersubjectivity framework is something that two sociolinguists or linguistic anthropologists published in 2004, Mary Buchholz and Kira Hall. And they have this kind of three sets of binaries. I'm just trying to find my notes so I don't leave any of them out because it's a little bit complicated. Let me scroll. So they have three dimensions that they use to examine how people construct identities during interaction. So basically it's part of a sociocultural framework of looking at identity not as something pre-existing, but that emerges during conversation or through discourse. So the one dimension is sameness versus difference. Another is genuineness versus artifice. And the third is institutional recognition versus structural marginalization. So the first one is, I look at how these two people, David and Keegan, use adequation, which is the construction of social sameness, to present similarities between Jewish and Muslim traditions and practices. And that can be, you know, at the lexical level, like saying things like repeating words, both of us do this, both of us do that. And it can also be more complicated than that with, you know, involving layers of context, like Brad mentioned. So looking at things like how they present their own religious practices. So Keegan talked about how they both practice Shabbat on Fridays and do Salat and Zakat and various Muslim rituals. David talked about kind of similarities between Jews and Muslims culturally and how they had interacted during or when his ancestors had lived in the Maghreb. And even, I think we haven't really touched on race yet, but one way that this comes up in my talks with David was that David saw their own race or ethnicity as kind of slippery and non-binary, that in the US, people perceived David as white, but when David lived in Europe, people perceived David as North African. And that in the US, sometimes because he wore clothing associated with, well, for David, it was North African clothing, but David felt that people in Toronto perceived it as Muslim clothing, and so would greet him as if he were a Muslim. And then rather than correcting them, David would just respond, Assalamu alaikum, or wa alaikum salam. In terms of authentication, and authorization, which I think relates to your second question about how the two of them connected to historical antecedents. David in particular brought up some Jewish Sufis in the past who were identified as Jews but were practicing Sufism or something similar to Islamic Sufism, that David used to kind of authorize their own involvement in a Muslim community. And in terms of that specific example of Zevi, what I was trying to show is that Zevi, you know, if you look at a lot of the research that's been done on him, was presented as having this kind of schizophrenic identity that, you know, maybe he wasn't really Muslim, and in that example, because of how he dressed and how he engaged with text, but that for these two individuals that I was looking at, they kind of blurred all of these distinctions. You know, they're reading from texts from both religions, wearing clothing associated with both religions. In Keegan's case, identifying very explicitly with both religions for various reasons, and kind of undermining this idea that to identify as a Muslim Jew means there's a kind of tug of war of identity. For them, they were very clear about their identities and didn't see these distinctions as having much value.
Thank you, Katrina. That's really interesting. It makes me think immediately of Shanon's chapter, particularly where he reflects on his own subject position and his own background as a gay Muslim, but also as a sociologist or anthropologist. Remind me.
Officially sociologist, but yeah, a bit of both.
You can blur those lines as well.
And so at one point towards the end of your chapter, you write something that's really interesting. You say, and that I think dovetails really nicely with what Katrina just said. You write, and I quote, "If my journey into a new understanding of Islam involved hugging the margins of orthodoxy, my growing engagement with Christianity propelled me beyond them. I now attend my partner's liberal Anglican church and participate in Christian worship as frequently, if not more, as I observe Islam. I read the Bible and Christian sacred texts as much as I do the Quran and Islamic writings. New friendships have also exposed me to different Jewish perspectives of spirituality, sexuality, and social justice. And you call yourself a spiritual omnivore who is happy to learn and absorb insights from many other traditions, including Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. And I'm just wondering here, from your perspective, how is it that you began on that journey? Is this something that you thought about for a very long time, this kind of syncretic approach to spirituality? And you kind of hinted at it a little bit in terms of being raised in a multiracial household in a country that is multiracial as well. Did those kinds of friendships and diversity within the family kind of lead you down this path? And what did the role of your sexuality play in kind of what looks to me to be a kind of queer approach to spirituality?
It's a really, really rich question. I suppose growing up in Malaysia, the reason why I suppose I am interested in this tension between text and context, what is authoritative and what is lived, is, growing up in the kind of hybrid household that I had. On my mother's side of the family, they're not Muslim. She's a Muslim convert. So we have Buddhists, Catholics, Protestants, Taoists, very, very typical Chinese Malaysian family that does lots of things. And on my dad's side, it's more Pakistani Sufi. And there was this kind of comfort with that existence, but always with the official narrative of Islam. You sort of feel you have to be in the closet about that as well. Like you have to sort of present to people that, no, I don't do all these funny things as a Muslim. Like I pray properly, I fast properly, so in terms of how you celebrate festivals as well. So I think initially, I suppose it was a resistance to the state. And here I'm not being a scholar yet. I'm just talking about the experience. I suppose then the sexuality stuff also, I guess, is quite peculiar to being Malaysian, because I came of age at a time when we had a deputy prime minister who was very publicly and infamously sacked on charges of corruption and sodomy, right? But he was also, at the time of his sacking, was seen as an Islamist, quote unquote Islamist, right? So already, like with that background in mind, this kind of, I have to keep all the hybridity secret. Then suddenly having this brought out to you by an authoritarian government saying, we are sacking this man because he's a sodomite, we are a Muslim nation, we do not do this. I think that was kind of the beginning of the real crisis for me of how to put these things together. But the more I did that, the more then, you have to dig into the past and think about, well, what is actually in the Islamic text in the Quran? How exactly did people interpret it? How did this continue or get ruptured during the era of colonialism in Malaysia and other parts of the Muslim world? And then the more you dig into that, the more you have to think, well, did British colonialism look like French colonialism? Did it look like Dutch colonialism? Why have things evolved in Indonesia in a sense where not in Malaysia and so on? And for a long time, I thought that this was probably unscholarly. I'm just inserting myself into my research if I talk about this. And certainly when I was, the research that I did for my PhD did involve, participant observation with queer Muslims in Malaysia and the UK. And I was honest about where I was in that. But the question that was asked was about your journey with Islam. So the responses were about Islam and so on, my engagement with the Quran, religious schools, madrasas, and so on. But like I said, part of my life was also, getting closer to my partner, going to his church, reading the Bible. So I guess this, and I was thinking, is this a new thing for me? Is this me being, I don't know, isolated? Are these isolated experiences that no one else has? And I'm really feeling quite liberated listening to the other presenters today, thinking that no, it's not an isolated experience. Actually, this traveling is not as uncommon as we think. And I guess what my chapter is trying to do is then I did try and go back to the Quran, to scholarship on the Quran, thinking, well, is this there in the substance of the text itself? And I think the answer that we're getting now is yes. Even in the style of the Quran, even in the language that it uses, the way it narrates certain themes, it was in active dialogue, not just with expressions of Judaism and Christianity at the time, but other kinds of religious expression, other political contexts. This is a text that is in dialogue with other texts, but why do we read it in a certain way? And I suppose the final provocation, and yeah, I guess when I tell this story about myself in the chapter as well, I'm also asking, am I alone? Is there anyone else out there? And if there's anyone else out there, why isn't this kind of knowledge and experience more visible? Why isn't it more accepted? And I guess this is where I try and tease a bit the question of epistemic authority within Islam, how it's created, the construction of Islam. What does that mean, the construction of religious boundaries? I don't know, I probably have a lot more to say, but I'll stop there for now because I feel like I could really go on if I wanted to.
Yeah, I wish you could really go on. At some point in time, we will have to have you back so that you can go on at length to your heart's content. And I don't think there's anything unscholarly about what you're saying at all. We're all in our work, and our work is in us. And if anything, you're being very honest about the process. And I think that's very scholarly. I have two questions for Rob and Edwige, and then we'll maybe have a more broader conversation. And then I see that we have already some questions in the Q&A. So I'll start with Rob. You were telling us that something surprised you in the corpus of articles that you looked at, and that was that these newspapers apparently don't really talk very much about LGBT Jews, and you were saying that they do relatively represent LGBT Muslims more. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit first about in those cases where LGBT Jews are present in these media representations, what kind of within what kind of discourses are they being represented? And I guess the same for LGBT Muslims, if you could refresh our memory. And finally, what do you think that tells us about the representation of racialized, gendered, and sexualized minorities?
Good question, Adi. Thank you. Yeah, so the findings really, in terms of LGBT Jews and Muslims as well, it appears that the discourse around these two groups, I'm trying to think of how to say this. It's not very substantial discourse, right? It's in the right-leaning body of text, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph. Most of the mentions of LGBT Muslims dealt with things like drag shows, Muslim drag queens, terrorism, of course, that type of thing, but never and a lot of discourse about somebody, Tan France, who I believe is on a television program called Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, and he's the Muslim member of the group. And a lot of talk about him, right, as being this representation of what a gay Muslim is. And I would argue that is not an accurate representation of Islamic queerness in general. And again, the same type of discourse around LGBTQ Jews, right? Lots of talk about a television program in Britain called My Big Fat Gay Jewish Conversion, that type of thing. So it's this kind of frivolous discourse, right? It's not talking about, there's no discourse in there about health disparities amongst LGBTQ Jews and Muslims, or anti-Semitism in the synagogue or Islamophobia in the mosque. It's all just sort of popular culture mishmash, right? To me, it means nothing in some ways, right? And I think the other part of it for both groups was this really sort of heavy reliance on American news, American politics, right? As if that had anything to do, with the politics of LGBT Muslims and Jews in Britain, right? And I always find it interesting that they make those kinds of connections, right? Lots of discourse about Steve Bannon, lots of discourse about Milo Yiannopoulos, who, if you remember, he was part of the Trump group at the beginning. I believe he identified originally as a gay Catholic, and then he, I believe, came out as a gay Jew, right? His discourse didn't change, right? His identity did. So I think those are the sort of, the bigger takeaways, right? The more obvious takeaways. And there's other takeaways too, as I said, this sort of ISIL or ISIS standing, as a placeholder for Islam. And so there's lots of sort of, and again, as I've done in my previous work, looking at the Singaporean media, I'm really more interested in the discourse around LGBTQ Muslims and Jews, as opposed to the discourse itself, right? I'm interested in what sort of the words and ideas in proximity to the discourse around LGBTQ Jews and Muslims. So those were that's sort of the short answer for that. I did want to say, if I could, to Shannon, I'm in the same boat as you in terms of including myself in my writing. I'm queer and Jewish, and I actually wrote a piece, I forget, it was 4 or 5 years ago, for an edited volume, and my piece was called Lessons from Jerusalem, Impossibilities in the Field. And it was on purpose self-reflective, right? It was part of an edited volume called Sex, Ethnographic Experiences, right? And I think of all of those, and as a somewhat religious Jew, I've always sort of struggled with my sexuality within my religion. And the whole piece was really sort of a first-person story of, spending a summer in Jerusalem at a yeshiva, and constantly negotiating my identity, right? I was always trying to pass as something else, right? And it's difficult, right? But I think that idea of including yourself in your writing, and I think some of my colleagues sort of dismissed that piece as like a reflection or a think piece. But I think it really was sort of a serious, a serious meditation on what it means, right, to be somebody who has a religious, spiritual connection to their faith, but also has this queer sexuality that has to be dealt with, right? So I don't think, I love the idea of including ourselves in our work, right? To an extent, of course. But I think our writing is influenced by our, you can't separate ourselves from our writing, right? I mean, I think everything we write has a piece of us in it. So yeah, so thank you for sharing that as well.
Absolutely, Rob, and thank you so much for that explanation. Very productive. So I have a question for Edwige, and then we'll move on to some of the questions that we've already received. You write early on in your chapter something quite interesting. You go on to really expand on it. But for those who don't have access to your chapter, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more. So I'm going to quote from the sentence that you wrote. In this corpus, queer characters and relations, often a pretense, a display, or disguise, automatically question the bounds of other identity categories. But moreover, the very notion of category itself. So I found that very interesting. In what ways do these characters and the relations that they have call into question category or categorization itself. And I think that's, if anyone else wants to jump in after Edwige, because I think that's kind of central to all of the contributions as well.
Yeah, I feel like this is, the main thing we're all addressing and struggling with. At least I know I am in almost everything that I write. But maybe a good way of answering the question is to do something that I haven't done in the presentation, which is to talk a little bit about the novels themselves. And I'm going to mention the second one, Messieurs, vous êtes impuissants, that I have mentioned, that novel from '61 by Blanche Bendaron. And in it, there are two characters in particular. So first of all, I should say that the world of that novel is inverted. This is the way that it is described. And in the French of that time period, inverted means the same thing as homosexual, but it's also literally inverted in the sense that people's names have been reversed, that sexualities have been changed, that people walk backwards, just anything you can imagine, like if it's bizarre world or something like this. And so in this inverted universe, there are two main characters that work together. One biological man who is an inverted, an inverti, meaning a homosexual, and one biologically female character who's described as a hermaphrodite. And neither one of them has unions with other characters. They're both intellectuals working on some secret, and no one knows what it is. And it's discovered later on in the novel that what they're actually doing is that they have this grand master plan to end racism and to end war in the world. And in order to do this, they inject everyone with the blood of Jewish and African babies. So everybody would be mixed race. And the result is that it creates this kind of new humanity, right? That is born from an inverted man and a hermaphrodite woman that has no race, that has no gender, that has no sexuality. And of course, it's a kind of crazy novel. It's science fiction. It's also a little bit dystopian because the author herself never truly, agrees with everything that is being done. But it's very interesting to see how someone who clearly struggles so much from being reduced to being, a Jewish woman writing at a very specific moment in history, in this case, specifically during the Algerian War of Independence, where Jews were really struggling with, finding their place in the new Algerian nation. It's very interesting to see how the kind of most extreme way where her imagination goes is in this complete reinvention of what it means to be human, in a way where categories have completely been broken down, and everyone is just kind of, living together without any label that can be applied to them to differentiate them. I don't know if that answers your question, but
oh, it more than answers. I'm also just wondering if anyone else wants to chime in there to weigh in a little bit. If not, I think we can go to some of the questions that we've already received. So we have a question from Amina from Algeria. And that question is for Edwige. How were these novels received by the Maghrebi Jewish community? Is there any similarity between the women of these novels with the women found in the works of Assia Jabbar?
thank you very much, Amina, for your questions. So as far as reception goes, both novels were very poorly received. The first one, the one from 1926, was received okay by people in France. Not, it didn't make a big splash or anything, but everything that Elisa Rais wrote was received very poorly by the Maghrebi Jewish community, especially the community in Algeria, mainly because people felt like she was a complete traitor because she was in a way disguising her own identity when writing. And the whole question of her personal disguise is very complicated because it's unclear if it's something that she wanted to do, if it is something that her publisher forced her to do. I think that in general, when scholars have tried to talk about that process, they've been very ungenerous with Raïs. They have kind of, not really taken into account what it meant in 1926 to be publishing a book as a Jewish Algerian woman who was, living all alone in Paris, who had left everything she knew in Algeria to come to Paris for the purpose of being a writer. And in her case, the only way that we know about the reception of her work is through echoes that have been recorded in the correspondence of some researchers at the time. So we also don't have a very extensive way of knowing, if it was discussed in the literary milieu of Algiers or anything like this. And for the second novel, to publish it, Ben-Dahan had to really downgrade her publishing house. Before that, she was publishing in kind of mainstream publishers in France. For that book, the public was much narrower, and in her introduction to it, she alludes to that difficulty. And I mentioned the fact that she says that she was tempted to hide her Jewish identity when she published it. And one of the reasons why was the kind of backlash she received when wanting to publish this book that was in a way about, undoing identities at a moment where, as I said again, but I want to repeat it, where Algerian Jews were really struggling with deciding whether or not they would join the kind of nationalist effort and movement in Algeria, or if they would be on the side of the French and just become completely French, which is in a way what happened after independence. So the books were problematic then, and I think they're still problematic now, as they stand and for their readership. And as to your question regarding Asya Jabbar, I think that they are definitely similarities that can be drawn. There's a very big dissimilarity in the way that Jabbar has this amazing status as a Francophone writer, and the other two didn't. I don't know if it's simply a question of talent, or if it's also just that the literary market was kind of not ready to accommodate them. I would tend to think there's a little bit of that. But maybe the strongest echo you can see in the kind of dissolution of categories is what Jabbar does in her novels, mostly with polyphony, right? And with this feminine polyphony, this multiplication of voices that also tends to erase the boundary between the self and the community. And I think that we can probably see a literary parallel or stylistic parallel there between all of those books.
Thank you, Edwige. The next two questions, I think we can group them together. They're quite similar. One is by Ishraf and the other one by George. The first question by Ishraf is a two-part question. I'm going to read it out. Are most religious scriptures inherently queerphobic, or is it the fact that interpreters, ulama, etc., unintentionally impose their queerphobic worldviews within their interpretations? Part two of the question: were there queer affirming interpretations back in the early days of Islam, or did they only emerge recently? And George's question for all the panelists is, you've mentioned challenges to and rejection of pluralist, non-conformist scholarship from orthodox and essentialist religious voices. How would you respond to this conflict given the dominance of traditional views in public discourse?
can take a stab at this a little bit, though I think maybe Shannon's work it most clearly addresses it. I would say that many interpreters are intentionally imposing their queerphobic worldviews within their interpretations. I don't see it as unintentional at all. I can't speak to religious scriptures broadly, but in my own reading of the Quran, I don't see it as queerphobic. I do see that as an interpretation that has been brought by others and has become kind of hegemonic. And in terms of kind of responding to traditional views and public discourse, my own approach is to produce this kind of ethnographic work that addresses lived religion, as Shanon mentioned. So rather than kind of trying to intervene directly in these debates, which I think, folks like Scott Kugel that Shanon mentioned have done quite well, I'm looking at how queer and queer inclusive Muslims are living their everyday lives, living their religion out, practicing their religion, engaging with one another to develop inclusive communities rather than constantly engaging with contesting those who would oppose them.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. I'd love to answer this, but is it okay to take a bit of time? Because they're in 3 parts and I'd really like to go through them properly. From my perspective, I think it's definitely true to say, and again, I'm talking about myself when I read these scriptures, whether they're the Hebrew scriptures, the New Testament, the Quran. I don't know if the texts themselves can be called homophobic, but they're definitely heteronormative. They're definitely patriarchal. That's how they're constructed. And that's the audience that they are speaking to, right? But as with so many scriptures, they're not monolithic. This is not a message that consistently runs through. There are moments of subversion as well in many parts of the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, in many parts of the New Testament, in many parts of the Quran. One clear example I can think of is there's a surah in the Quran, a very short one, Al-Mujadilah, which translates as she who disputed. Now, this is about a woman who basically was not happy with a ruling that the Prophet Muhammad made on her marriage. She was basically suffering from domestic abuse from her husband. And if we are to take this chapter of the Quran for its literal sense, she's basically telling him off. She's saying, you are being a stereotypical patriarch. You are excusing the domestic violence that my husband is imposing on me. I don't trust you as a prophet. I am taking my complaint directly to God, right? The story of this chapter then is that in the worldview of the Quran, God responds and rebukes Muhammad and says, she's right, you're wrong. You need to rebuke her husband. She needs justice, right? And in lots of the early Muslim commentaries, there are different variants of this, but there is a commentary that the lineage goes to Aisha, one of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad, his youngest wife. The way she tells the story of this woman, and this woman, in the commentaries, we know her name, but in the Quran, we don't. Basically, she goes around telling people, that chapter in the Quran, Al-Mujadilah, yeah, I did that, right? I challenged it, so that's there. I took the Prophet down a notch, right? She's really proud of it because she got justice, right? So there are these bits in all of the scriptures, as far as I've come across, that, they're very deliciously subversive of the main frame of patriarchy and heteronormativity. And I think, of course, over the ages, most of the ulama were men. If you become a religious specialist and professional within a patriarchal system, you tend to want to reproduce your position of privilege and power, right? But even then, I think there is an element, especially in Islamic legal theory, where people do have to take their context seriously. They have to take each problem as it comes. You can't just make a pronouncement from the Quran or from the sacred text that doesn't speak to the person's context that's coming to you. And you see this a lot with marriage and divorce laws in Islam that are quite different across the schools of jurisprudence. Like, I won't go into detail, but it's there, right? And it's there when the ulama come across people who, in our language now, we would term as non-binary, the muhannath, the khanith, right? So they have to think about, well, if a person is non-binary, then what happens to their inheritance rights? And it's not always black and white. You know, it's not always, well, they're non-binary, they don't deserve anything. You know, they will go through quite, you know, traditional and maybe, you know, to our minds, ways of thinking that don't make sense to us. Like, they would think, well, you know, if this person doesn't identify as male or female or whatever, then they have to have this share of the inheritance and so on. Like, it's a different kind of calculus, but it was there and they were grappling with it. Yeah, and people disagreed as well as to the punishment for homosexuality, or homosexual relations, I should say. It wasn't the identity, it was the act. Because what Islamic jurisprudence really outlawed was penetration by a male sexual organ into a place that it didn't belong to. And a place that it didn't belong to was anywhere that wasn't a vagina that it was married to, right? So this is the logic. It's very phallocentric, it's very heteronormative, it's very patriarchal. But of course, then there are sort of antibodies that we find within the Muslim tradition as well. And there are different genres of tradition, right? There's the hadith, which are the more legalistic compilations of what the Prophet did and said, which are used to derive laws. But then there's the seerah, which is the more biographical material, right? And there are other sorts of material as well in different traditions of Islam. We can think of Sufism, the mystical tradition of Islam, where people express discomforts with things in different ways. And again, you know, not to go into detail, but this is there. And I think possibly what's happened with Islam as a tradition, and you know, this is not my own work and it's not in my chapter. This is from Tarif Khalidi, who is a scholar of the Quran. He says there's a shift, you know, in early Islam, people recorded everything, you know, everything that the Prophet did or said, everything that his companions did or said, whether they agreed with it or not, whether it made sense to them or not, because for them it was about preserving the tradition. So they even included things that they were very uncomfortable with, you know, which are there in the tradition now and which have been capitalized. So there are racist traditions as well in the hadith and in early Muslim texts, where there are reports of the Prophet saying quite racist things about Black people, right? But it is later Muslims who thought, well, we can't rely on this now because he would never say such a thing. But they continue relying on the stuff that sounds misogynistic and homophobic now. Why, right? So why this selectivity? And, you know, we'll never know what to do with these. Tarif Khalidi calls them antibodies. They are things that made Muslims uncomfortable, but which they included in the tradition for the sake of completeness. And we have to think about them, we have to select them. So I don't have a short answer to this, except to say that we just need to be comfortable with the antibodies. I mean, this is an unfortunate analogy to make in a time of a global pandemic, but, you know, it's like, yeah, how do you inoculate yourself against one-sided views of your tradition and take it as a whole? And you have a choice, right? Like, I mean, now I'm speaking as a Muslim, I'm speaking as a believer. Like, in this faith, we talk about ilm, and ilm is a social construct as well, it's a political construct. Who gets to say that they have knowledge? Who gets to transmit that knowledge? That's always been up for challenge, right? So yeah, I think I'm going off on a tangent now. I'll stop there, but I think that's my contribution to those questions.
That's really interesting, Shanon, because especially what you said at the end there, that you know, that's you talking as a Muslim, as a believer, and it, you know, I realized that we didn't really define what it means to be Muslim or what it means to be Jewish, and when we talk about queerphobia in religious traditions or queer-affirming interpretations, a lot of that is actually depending on the subject positions of individuals. This morning I got a message from someone who asked asked a question about the makeup of the roundtable, and they were saying that it doesn't seem that there's much Jewish representation on this roundtable. So it seems like a one-sided conversation. And it made me think, what kind of assumptions is this person having about who is Jewish based on how they look, or maybe, based on their last name. The scholar Aaron Hughes, who spoke at a GMRN event some time ago, began actually by talking about his own identity and how many times he gets asked sometimes, okay, but what is your mother's name? As if to sort of like, ascertain whether this person can speak from a place of authenticity or not. And so when I was listening to Shanon, I was thinking, we have a different approach if we're talking about Islam from a personal perspective, because I'm not a believer and I don't have faith at all, but I have an attachment to Islam as culture. But then also Islam as culture looks different for me as a Southeast Asian and a South Asian than it would to say a North African, and then even then based on like what region we're talking about. There are always going to be differences, but then also individual variations. And so my approach has always been sort of the scriptures exist, various interpretations exist, but you do what you do with it in order for you to live a fulfilling life. And this actually was a conversation I had with a colleague of mine last week, Carla. Hi, Carla. I think she's here. And that's the approach I think that many LGBT plus Muslims, Jews, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, so on and so forth have when it comes to making sense of their identities. Sure, it can be helpful to read, say, Scott Kugel, who's really getting into the nitty-gritty aspects of scripture and jurisprudence. But that's not the only way. There are plenty of people who are just like, whether they believe or not, whether they practice or not, I don't see a contradiction. And that I think is also a valid approach. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this? I see Edwige nodding. Go ahead.
I think that as someone whose family name is mine, I'm pretty I don't know, compelled to jump in. I don't know how I want to answer to this message that that you received, but one thing that is very, very interesting to me, and I think it's a kind of tangential way of answering the message and connecting to what people have been saying about the personal connection we can have with our work. And I'll just say an anecdote and you can make of it what you wish. But for me, when I started being interested in all of those modes of negotiating identity, of expressing one's identity in the empire, and especially trying to find a way to express your identity, or to express yourself rather, that did not conform to colonial labels that were really meant to separate people and to control them better. I went into an archive, which is the archive of the Alliance Israélite in Paris, which was a very big group, big association that took in young people from all around the Mediterranean, Jewish people, trained them to speak French, to become French teachers, and then send them again to other regions of North Africa and the rest of the southern border of the Mediterranean, so they would become agents of Frenchification into Jewish communities. And I was really going there only for the purpose of doing my research and working on whatever it is I was working on. And I ended up finding there letters from my own great-grandmother. And I had known that she was employed by this organization, but I didn't have anything material that was left from her. And all of a sudden I realized that there lying dormant, in a place where it's actually very easy to go if you bother to do it, was all of this background, right? All of this story about myself and about other things, about history too, that could be accessible. And I think there's a real danger, and this is truly what I see in France today, and it's what I'm learning from those women I'm studying in my project. A real danger in equating identity with visibility, or in trying to equate identity with authenticity in some way, as if there was one way of performing, one way of displaying who you really are. And as soon as we start thinking, in my opinion, of identity in such terms, we end up taking away its potential for resistance and for counterculture in a way. So that's just all I wanted to say. It's, I think, tying back to what I said about unreadability at the beginning, a way of trying to be seen without letting others define you. And I think that this notion of an unreadable identity is maybe much more powerful than we think often today.
Could I add to Edwige's observations and your comments, Adi?
Shannon, please.
I think this is
Rob wants to jump in as well, right? Yeah. So Shannon, then Rob, and then we'll take 2 more questions, and I suppose we'll wrap up after that.
Yeah. I think something that I didn't make obvious in my responses, and I'm dying to, is the colonial violence that resulted in the way we think about identity now in countries like Malaysia and possibly Singapore as well, right? So the fact that I say that I'm a believer, like there's been a process for me internally, but also I know that in my case, the state in Malaysia categorizes me as a believer, whether I like it or not, and categorizes me as Malay. And this is a legacy of British colonialism, of just sort of counting people and sorting them into different racial categories and inventing them, right? So when I found out that in Indonesia, there's no such, legal or constitutional connection between being a quote unquote native Indonesian and being Muslim, I mean, my mind was blown. I was like, wow, can that even be such a thing? Can you be a Malay and not a Muslim? Is that possible? Because in my mind, that those things were linked. And it took a while to think that, well, this is actually a quirk of British colonialism that sort of racialized Islam and religionized Malay identity as well. So I think we have to sort of acknowledge that and acknowledge how it continues now and how it affects the politics of Islam in so many countries, especially those with the British colonial past. And I think this sits alongside a lot of, I think I mentioned the antibodies that are in the Islamic texts, that I think, and colonialism went hand in hand with a certain kind of Orientalist view of what Islam meant, right? And ways to sort of manage Muslim populations through the prism of gender and sexuality and so on. I mean, the example I can think of is the opposition to child marriage. For the longest time in the West, there was no opposition to child marriage. We have monarchs in the UK who got married as minors, Is it Queen Mary or something? William and Mary, how old was she? 13 or something? Like there was no actual disgust at marrying young girls. But at some point, I think this became a point of contention in lots of British colonies, like the desire of British imperialists to impose certain forms of legislation on marriage and childbearing and so on Muslim populations. So then this became the sticking point. You Muslims marry young girls, this is wrong, right? And then the anti-colonial response was, yeah, we do, and we're going to resist your imposition because this is our right as Muslims. I mean, I'm simplifying this terribly. This is a really crude simplification, but that's the dynamic that we see as well, right? This kind of push and pull where, you find something to fight about when actually in the actual tradition, in the actual political and social practice, it's much more complicated in different contexts. right? But it just becomes polemicized and politicized. And I'm not saying that there is absolutely no homophobia or transphobia in Muslim communities. Like, I know there is. I've been there, I've seen it, I've experienced it. But I'm just saying that these polemics that we see in sort of Orientalist fantasies of what Muslims are and the racialization of Muslims and where gender and sexuality sits in that, I mean, that's still very much alive, and we have to pay attention to that.
Yeah, let me just add to that as well. Just sort of, a lot of this is reminding me of how categories fail us, right? And just I think just the very act, as other people have said, of separating bodies based on these characteristics is a very sort of colonial artifact, right? And again, I often, and again, getting back to Adi's point about the lack of Jewish representation, I always get comments about my last name, right? My father's Catholic, my mother's Jewish. And so I'm a hybrid as well, right? And so I know a lot about Catholicism, a lot about Christianity. People say to me all the time when they find out that I'm Jewish, they always say the same thing: you don't look Jewish, right? And I always, it used to really irritate me right in the beginning, but now I do sort of understand that way of thinking, right? People have an idea of what a Jew looks like, what a Muslim looks like, that type of thing. And I think it's really sort of telling when people say things like that, right? That they do have these categories in mind about what certain people are and what certain people are not. And I always like to think that, all right, I tell my students a lot when we discuss Jewish observance, Jewish practice, that there's 15 million Jews in the world, and I think there's 15 million ways to be Jewish, right? I don't think it's necessarily this kind of, any of these traditions are monolithic. That I think that they're already queer, right? Yeah, so I just think it's interesting, that these different kinds of ideas that keep coming up over and over and over again, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to add one thing because, as always, Shanon talking about Malaysia makes me think about Singapore. It's a similar. Both countries used to be one country. There's very similar culture, and the various ethnic groups are represented in both countries at different percentages, but you have similar sets of assumptions as well, in large part due to the recent colonial history. And what I find often is existing in Singapore, not when I interact with Malay Singaporeans or Indian Singaporeans, but I'm very often mistaken for Malay, and that's because people assume that if you're Muslim, you have to be Malay, and you can't be anything else but Malay. So that's very much conflated in Singapore. It comes with a whole set of stereotypes as well about what it means to be Malay, particularly in a country that's dominated by Chinese Singaporeans. Now, having said that, I realized that we're coming towards the end, and maybe the most important thing that we haven't really talked about, but that we've sort of, each of us have kind of hinted at and like tried to tease out in our own ways, is really the colonial legacy and the question of race within these debates. And as we know, our ideas that we have about the gender binary or homosexuality, heterosexuality are very colonial ideas, and that you have throughout the world a history of diverse understandings of how to express your identity through whether it is in terms of desires or in terms of bodily expressions that don't fit in within these sets of binaries, which are very much rooted in modern Europe or early modern Europe. And one way that colonizers justified colonization was to make this very sort of crude and simple, was that these people don't have a clear gender binary, or these people are not strictly heterosexual, and so they're inferior because they haven't evolved to a point where they respect these binary differences, and that worked hand in hand with racial classifications that justify wide-scale exploitation, expropriation, genocide, colonialism, and we're still living with the legacies today. And the funny thing is, speaking from a Singaporean perspective, and I'm sure Shanon will agree with me, is that from a Malaysian perspective, is that in our countries, both within and outside of the Muslim community, the argument gets twisted a little bit into that. You are importing Western ideas about sexuality and non-binary gender into our Asian countries. And that becomes a very interesting way of repurposing the tools of colonialism I don't know if you will agree with this in Malaysia, but I consider Singapore to be a neo-colonial state that functions like a colonial power in Southeast Asia, particularly with its practice of what I would call indentured servitude that essentially exploits many Southeast Asian and South Asian workers to build essentially the entire country and its infrastructure. So that's a bit of a conundrum, and I'm opening up a whole can of worms when we have 10 minutes, but I'm wondering if anyone has anything to bring to that conversation, maybe from a different geographical perspective, whether it's Malaysia or North Africa or North America.
I hesitate to jump in because it's it's a very
the whole thing, right?
And difficult question, but I'll answer very briefly from my kind of historical perspective as someone who works mostly on the colonial period, and I'll say that the same discourse can be sensed today in North Africa, right? A way for people in power, for religious figures, for political authority, to say all of this corruption is brought about by basically by the European element, by the French, and I will not comment on that and on contemporary politics, but what I will say is that this is not a new idea at all, and that in fact when the idea of the Arab pederast, as it was called in the 19th century, really takes shape in colonial discourse, there is this notion that, you know, as you were saying, when the locals are performing same-sex relations or whatever, they just don't really know what they're doing. You don't really know what is sex or what isn't sex. It's truly when the real virile European Frenchman comes in that, you know, sex starts to matter. And in this respect, oftentimes the focus of commentators is on same-sex relationship between Europeans and indigenous people, as they're called back in the day. And so one argument that I saw repeated over and over and over, especially in the medical legal treatises of the 19th and early 20th century, is that homosexual desire really blossoms between French people and locals. And this discourse is true in the case of same-sex relations between men, but also between women. And I'm even thinking of one author who says Algerian women, or the Algerian culture is not, Algerian civilization is not refined enough for there to be same-sex relations between women. You need Europeans to come in order for that to happen, right? And so same-sex relations between women can only happen between a French woman and an Arab woman. And we see here already kind of the, you know, the germination of an idea that unfortunately will have a very long future, right?
Yeah, I feel like I've said a lot,
Shanon, go
but I
ahead.
really want to, I really do want to come in on this as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think with the colonial question, the other C word that we haven't mentioned is capitalism, and they both went hand in hand, right? I think colonialism was a certain kind of capitalist venture about subjugating certain populations, extracting their labor and extracting their resources to enrich the mothership, whether that was France or Britain or Germany or whatever, right? And I think it's helpful to distinguish between the practice of colonialism, the actual economic structures that were disrupted and invented, and the ideology of imperialism, that which justifies colonialism. And I think gender, sexuality, and race sit in both realms, you know, but how are they abstracted and how do they work actually in everyday practice? So I think a class analysis is essential as well to see how this has developed in territories like Malaysia and Singapore, because we know in Malaysia and Singapore, the myth about Malays, ethnic Malays, is that they're lazy and they're stupid and they can't do anything themselves, right? They can't lead their countries. This is a colonial invention, but it's a myth. I mean, the only reason why the British thought the Malays were lazy was because they refused to participate in colonial capitalist ventures. They refused to work on plantations. They refused to work on the mines. Indentured labor by Chinese and Indians had to be brought in. I'm not saying that there weren't racist stereotypes about Chinese and Indians. They were, but they weren't called lazy. They were called a lot of other things, but not lazy, right? This is the kind of stuff that has been internalized in countries like Malaysia and Singapore now. Why? Because independence was given to elites, right? Elites who sort of had to negotiate with the colonial powers. You know, the people who resisted and fought, you know, the leftist movements in Malaysia and Singapore, they're the ones that died out, right? They're the ones that got defeated. And I'm not saying that there wasn't resistance to colonialism within Britain as well, but again, those were the voices that lost. Eventually, you get the voices that won, who can perpetuate the system, and underpinning the system is capitalism, right? So again, then we have to ask, well, when we have these regulations about sex and gender, these teachings in religion about sex and gender, who are the people who get targeted? So under the penal code of Malaysia, which is, you know, inherited from the Indian penal code, which criminalizes, you know, carnal intercourse against the order of nature, you know, the anti-sodomy law, section 377, I think that it's been rarely applied in Malaysia. It was introduced by the British. In post-independence Malaysia, the vast majority of times it has been used is against one person, Anwar Ibrahim, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia, now opposition leader. So this law that we see as so homophobic, it's mostly been used for political purposes. But what are some of the other laws that get used, right? So there's this burgeoning Islamization in Malaysia, the Sharia laws that get imposed. They target working class, visible trans women mostly, right? Elite gay men and elite lesbians, you know, they don't really have to worry about these laws because they don't come for them. I mean, so again, there's a lot in here. I'm just going to leave it for now, but there is this class and capitalist element that we have to interrogate as well.
Thank you. That resonates so much with me from a Singaporean perspective, and I just want to mention to anyone who was interested in what Shanon was saying that on the stereotypes of Malays as colonial and neo-colonial stereotypes, Said Hussein Alatas in 1977, I think, wrote an excellent book called The Myth of the Lazy Native, where he analyzes and challenges this colonial myth that still remains very important in Malaysia. And in relation to the racialization of Indian workers, a good book to check out is quite recent by John Solomon at the National University of Singapore wrote a book that's called A Subaltern History of the Indian Diaspora in Singapore. I'll leave it at that, and we don't really have much time, but I think maybe we can end with one of the questions from the audience, and I'm just trying to pull it up now. Okay, there it is. So this is from Adam, and his question is quite specifically for Rob. And he wants to know if Rob can say more about returning to observance, which you mentioned briefly at the beginning of your talk. What has that meant for those making that return? And why do you think that is in relation to our times?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, so the movement that I'm talking about is known, well, the process I'm talking about is called teshuvah, which in Hebrew means return or redemption. And a Jewish person who sort of goes through this process is returning to a life of observance from a period of non-observance. And so I began to notice this trend in about 2015, 2016, among some of the gay Jewish groups that I'm a part of. And it is this movement. I think it has a lot to do with the times we live in. A lot of observant Jewish men became very disillusioned, I think, with the emphasis on sex and bodies and youth in the gay world, and began to explore ways of getting back in touch with their faith, and as a way of rejecting that way of life, right? The sort of Western idea of what it means to be LGBT. And so for many of these men, you know, their lives were fraught in many different ways. That, you know, that dissonance, right, between identities, right? The idea, and I wrote about this a lot in my work on Singapore. The idea for many of the men I worked with in Singapore was that it is impossible to be at once Singaporean and gay, right? Those two things don't work together. And I found the same thing in these Jewish communities with these men who had originally believed that it was impossible to be both gay and Jewish. And so, you know, and to be observantly Jewish. And so a lot of what the men that I worked with spoke about was this rejection of sort of the modern world, a return to this, what I would argue is a imagined traditional world of Judaism, but really just a sort of a complete paradigm shift in the way that they were living their lives. Does that sort of answer the question? That's basically what it is. And the men themselves are referred to as Baal Teshuvah, or masters of redemption, right? So they've sort of returned to a place that they truly belong, right? In sort of in their words. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you, Rob. I think we'll have to, I'm very sad, but I think we'll have to end the conversation here. It's been 2 hours, but it honestly felt like 10 minutes for me. Maybe some of the people listening and disagree, but it's been a blast for me at the very least, and yeah. It's great to see all of you and to talk to you. Thank you so much again to everyone who's made this possible at the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, and my colleagues at the Jewish Muslim Research Network. And again, thank you, Jillian, and thanks to all the speakers and everyone who attended today. And I wish you all an excellent weekend ahead.
For having us. Thanks to all of you. It's great.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Adi. Thanks Jillian.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank
Adi.
you everybody. Thank you very much.